given that God knew that Judas will betray Jesus, can Judas still freely choose not to betray Jesus? Okay. So this is a question that a lot of people have asked, right? Doesn't God's foreknowledge implies fatalism? Now, actually, the answer is no. Why? Because divine omniscience, divine foreknowledge has no causal effect on human free will, and therefore it does not affect human choice. Okay. So we need to draw a distinction between could and would. So what I would say is that given that God already knew that Judas would betray Jesus, Judas could still have chosen not to betray Jesus, but he would not. Okay. So let me explain this a bit more. Now, let me use an analogy. I suppose I know my daughter so well that I predicted that she would choose to leave the house 1 hour later to go shopping. Now, 1 hour later, she indeed left the house. Okay. Now, did my foreknowledge cause her to leave her house? Of course not, right? My free knowledge did not determine her choice. It is her choice. She freely choose to leave. Nobody forced her to do so, right? So it is her own libertarian free choice. So likewise, God's foreknowledge of Adam's choice did not cause Adam to choice, right? It doesn't determine Adam's choice. God created Adam as a free person, and Adam was free to choose whether to obey God or not. Nobody forced him to sin. Thus, Adam could still have chosen otherwise, but he would not, right? He freely chose to reject God. Now, some people may ask, but what if Adam chose otherwise? Okay. What if Adam chose to obey God? Now, the answer is, if Adam had chosen otherwise, then God would have foreknown otherwise, right? So if Adam had chosen to obey God, then God would know that he would choose to obey God, right? So God would have known otherwise, right? If Adam would have chosen otherwise. What God already know beforehand must happen, isn't it? So how could Adam still have chosen otherwise? Now, this is a very good question, and many of my students have asked this question. However, we need to point out that this objection actually commits a logical fallacy known as the modal fallacy. Okay. So the modal fallacy, okay, so let's think about these two sentences. The first sentence says, necessarily what God foreknew would happen. And the second sentence says, what God foreknew would necessarily happen. Now, very often people confuse these two sentences. Okay? They think that these two sentences are equivalent. Actually, they are not. Okay. The first sentence is correct, but the second one is wrong. Okay. It is true that God cannot be wrong about what he knew, and so necessarily what God foreknew would happen. But this does not imply that the events that God knows about happen necessarily, right? It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that Adam sinned necessarily. No, it's his own choice. Okay. And so the first sentence is right, but it doesn't mean the second sentence is true, right? It doesn't mean that what God knew happened necessarily. No. So Adam still could have chosen otherwise, but he would not. And God knew beforehand that he would not. So in that case, what God knew would happen, but it happened as the result of free choice rather than happen necessarily. Okay. So in conclusion, free choice is not excluded by divine foreknowledge. Divine foreknowledge is just God knowing what we would do, but that doesn't determine our choice. It is still our choice, right? We freely choose whether to obey or disobey, and we have to be responsible for our choice.